Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a nice day wherever you're visiting us from. We're waiting for people to join. We have people have signed up and they've represent more than 30 countries. And they also represent all kinds of job roles as alumni relations officers, directors of giving, principals, student development managers, community managers, and much more, as you can see. So wonderful. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, you may use the, you may ask questions anytime throughout the webinar. Just use the Q&A. Everybody can see it at the bottom of the screen. Is the Q&A box, and just go ahead and write your question there. We will do our best to answer them live at the end of the session. We'll have about 15 minutes to answer your questions. Okay, I think that we're all ready to start. So hello and welcome everyone. I'm Sandra Rincon. I'm the founder and president of the NL Alumni Network. It's for international students and alumni in the Netherlands. I'm also a host of Bright Ideas. It's a podcast for advancement professionals. Now I have the pleasure of welcoming our three guests for today's webinar on evaluating impact, getting alumni engagement metrics to work for you. So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. So Jenny Cooke-Smith. Hello, Jenny.
Hello.
She is Senior Director of AMAtlas Service at CASE. That is the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, where she enjoys being an agent of positive change with a commitment to delivering positive outcomes and results. She has an extensive experience in advancement, particularly in analyzing fundraising trends across the globe. She's also an undergraduate alum of the University of South Carolina. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Joe Gardner is, hello, Joe, is the head of alumni relations at Imperial College London, where she has been expanding the engagement offering to 240,000 alumni from over 200 countries in the last 6 years. One of her many areas of responsibility is the online alumni community platform called Imperial Plexus. And it is powered by Hivebrite and launched in 2018. And since Joe has been leading the implementation. Joe is an undergraduate alum of Bath Spa University. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you for having me.
Andy Shaindlin. Hi, Andy.
Hi there.
Is vice president with the Globe consultancy firm GGNA. As consultant at GGNA, Andy works with all kinds of alumni communities on strategy, programming, alumni engagement. Andy has more than 33 years of experience in advancement. His most recent institutional role was as vice president of alumni relations at his undergraduate alma mater, Brown University. Welcome, Jenny, Joe, and Andy. Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. So we thought we would get started, given that, CASE has developed an alumni engagement matrix framework to help advancement leaders who want to be more data-driven, right, when making decisions. We've asked Jenny if she could tell us more about the tool and why it's important and what are some of its benefits. So Jenny, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. And we thought it might help for a visual as well for all of you. So CASE has developed this model or this framework for measuring engagement, but I need to say, especially as we have representatives from 30 countries here today, CASE members come from 83 countries around the world. And one of, I think, the more interesting things in developing this framework is that we felt like it was actually a pain point for all of our members from all of those 83 countries, and really trying to figure out, A, how do we measure engagement? And then how do we do it in a way that is consistent, no matter what our institutions are and where those institutions may be in the world. And so as you can see, through much debate, and I'm guessing some of you were probably part of those conversations, there's a lot of different ways we could take this, but it seemed like simpler was a little bit better. And so the idea with engagement is really understanding your count of alumni who are engaged in 1, 2, 3, or 4 of the buckets that you can see here. Just to walk through briefly for those of you that might not be familiar with this framework, philanthropic is really, did they make a gift? So in this type of analysis, it's not so much how much they gave, but did they make a monetary gift to your institution? Volunteerism, we're really looking at formally defined volunteer roles. And we do have a document that walks through all of the different things that count and don't count. So something that we're happy to discuss in depth with those of you that might be trying to, A, think about what should we be capturing, and B, how do we do that in line with the CASE metrics? I'm going to skip communication for a good reason. We're going to come back to that, but experiential is really how do alumni engage with one another. So events are probably the primary piece for many of you, virtual and in person, as well as for those of you that have dues paying Alumni Association memberships. And then your, this is probably a bigger deal in the States, but with athletic programs, those of you that have seating ticket holders, that would fit into that categorization as well. And then we'll go back to communication. And I left it for the end because I think we can all agree it is perhaps the murkiest of the 4 categories. And communication is going to be all of the ways our alumni are engaging with us, primarily online. So of course that's social, which I will say most institutions are not yet capturing, and that's okay. As well as alumni that are clicking through on an email that you're sending, and then some things that I'm assuming you're all doing, but may not necessarily know who is doing this. And that's things like submitting updates to data, responding to your surveys, etc. Communication is optional. And so again, part of what I think is exciting about the metrics in this conversation is that in many ways, no matter what institution you're with, you're probably somewhat early on in that journey of collection. And so, part of what I'm hoping we can suss out in this conversation is how do we get started, even if we know we don't have it all.
Thank you, Jenny, for that. That framework really gives us a good place to start in our conversation. And one of the benefits, I guess, for this framework is that universities can benchmark, right? And so the question here is, should universities benchmark, and why? Are there, positive aspects, and what are the positive or the negative aspects of benchmarking, and what should we take into account? So I'm gonna ask Andy to start this discussion, since as a consultant you come across a lot of diversity of universities, institutions, and also organizations. So what do you see in the field, Andy?
Yeah, so I mean, the pros and cons of benchmarking, I think as Jenny already indicated, there's so many differences, even within a small geographical region. You have every kind of institution. And as you said, Sandra, I work not only with universities and colleges and schools, but foundations and NGOs and government agencies and public school, that, all kinds of organizations that have alumni types of audiences. So, there are kind of two, I think of it as there are kind of two basic ways to benchmark. One is to benchmark your organization's progress against other organizations. The second is to benchmark internally against your own progress towards goals that you've set for yourself. And I do think that while it can be instructive to know what other people prioritize, what they're measuring, how they're tracking things, it can sometimes be misleading because you don't always incorporate into your analysis all the differences in the institutions themselves, the student experience, the cultural aspect of that institution, the academic mission, the scale, the setting, the funding, the staffing, it's just the maturity of the program. How long have you even been doing this work, So I encourage people to understand each other's sort of peer priorities, but I really also encourage people to focus more on internal benchmarking. Measure the metrics, and I think if we talk about like how you define engagement, which I think we may, you have a definition for engagement at your institution. Jenny gave us some sort of industry standards a minute ago. You track your current status against those metrics, and then you track your own progress against those indicators internally over time. You have a strategy, you have some goals set, and you should pay maybe more attention to whether you're actually on track to achieve your own goals than whether you're competing effectively or ineffectively with an institution, which in terms of alumni engagement, you're not actually competing with them anyway. Unlike in say attracting research funding for academics, they have to compete with other institutions. Admissions has to enroll students who have a choice of where to matriculate. But with alumni, our audiences are already sort of identified, and so we can worry more about our own progress internally over time.
Thanks, Andy. I really like the distinction that you make in terms of the external and internal. And I think that a lot of the times leadership is very concerned with the external much more than the internal. And for us, actually, the internal is perhaps much more meaningful. Joe, what's your intake in this? I mean, from an institutional perspective, do you divide it like that, or is there more pressure for you to, have benchmarking from an external perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because I think it's important for leadership, particularly leadership within the institution that you're in, who perhaps don't necessarily have that understanding of what alumni relations is, what engagement really quantifies as, to be able to really show that through benchmarking. I think that's really important. And I will say that, as Andy kind of touched upon, there's that element there of non-competitive nature. So when you look at the AEM report and you can see who your direct peers are, it's a really great way then for us to have those conversations in a non-competitive environment, share best practice and really understand it. Mm-hmm. I think what is worth kind of pointing out at this point is change, and benchmarking is fundamental for our external, internal leadership understanding of what alumni relations really is. But then also, how does that shift and change? For example, we've got we have a new president coming into Imperial soon. What's their take going to be on alumni relations? How's that going to shift? But also, more importantly, how is CASE going to kind of shift its own definitions around what engagement looks like? We've already seen that in the reporting basis that we go through now. It was different in the past. It's, now the AEM report that we're doing. How far can we benchmark? How much conversation is really taking place as well with CASE and the changing kind of definition of what alumni relations looks like, and the time frame that we can really focus on that change happening, and whether or not it changes the benchmark for different people.
Well, maybe, thank you, Joe, for that, because you move us actually to the next question that I had for you, and maybe for all three of you, and maybe Jenny can address this one, since you started asking the question in terms of the definition. How do we define engagement, and do we have a universal agreed definition for it? And I think that looking at CASE's definition is a good starting point. Maybe you want to give us some insight in that, Jenny, and then we can follow up with a discussion on it.
Sure. So I alluded to this earlier, that getting to the stage we're at involved many, many brains. And this is actually the output of that exercise. So back in 2018, really is this question around how do we benchmark engagement continued to come to a head. The Case Alumni Relations Commission, which is a group of volunteers, again, that consist of global members, put together a task force to say, let's figure this out. Let's figure out an agreed upon definition of engagement. And funny enough, what the first outcome was, oh, we actually don't even agree with what alumni means. So before we can even think about what does it take to be engaged, we need to take a step back and think, who the heck are we even talking about? And so I'm sharing both of those definitions with you today. And I always tell people, if you're just really getting into this work, I think that white paper is a fantastic place to start, simply because it really outlines a lot of the groundwork of why this work is so important. And then you can start thinking about the resources to do the what. But as you can see, the white paper outlines alumni in a really broad net. And I think as we come, over 2 years from a global pandemic and think about how the work of our institutions has really shifted online, it feels really fortuitous that we said, let's think about anyone that's interacting with our institutions to learn. And that's really our basis for alumni. Now we know that people that perhaps achieved multiple degrees at your institution are perhaps going to have a different relationship than someone that did a certificate program online. And so you'll see that we've got some different categorizations of that. But at the end of the day, let's not throw out those individuals because that's probably a very growing area for many of our institutions. As we examine the what, hopefully you've had a chance to process that definition. The words I will call your attention to are mutually beneficial relationships. So we're not just talking about what are our alumni doing for our schools, but also thinking about how the work that you all are doing impacts that loyalty and really inspires that virtuous circle.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jenny, for that. You reminded me of the exchange students, or alumni students that
Yeah.
and they usually when I used to work with an institution with the international alumni, we would not consider them alumni because they hadn't gotten it, but we would welcome them in the events and we would, invite them anyway because they were actually so committed and so, connected to the institution that had given them the opportunity to go abroad or where they had been abroad. So definitely. I don't know, Jenny, I'm sorry, Joe and Andy, what's your intake in terms of, let's have this conversation about, how do we define alumni? How do we define engagement?
Yeah, and actually, it's a conversation that we're still having, and we've been having it for a long time. What do we fully define alumni as, and who are associates, and how do we program based on those different kind of groups of people, those different audiences that we have? So that's definitely something that I can't sit here and say, yep, here's our top line definition on who these people are. So it's definitely always an evolving thing, and I think again that comes down to that change piece as well. I don't know how about you, Andy?
I think on defining alumni, I was actually thinking about you being at Imperial, Joe, and thinking back to my time working at Caltech, where we had a vigorous debate about postdoctoral scholars who were some of the most accomplished people in their professional fields. They weren't students, they were employees. So, human resources had some responsibility for the data. They weren't alumni because they didn't have a diploma. So we were told that we weren't allowed to, give them membership. And it was this weird debate. And then as soon as a couple of postdocs made significant financial contributions,
It all changed.
guess what? The definition was suddenly broader than it had been before. But the point is, and I think this applies with what I said about metrics in general, right? Which is to be internally consistent. If you say, oh, we had X% of participation, and then a year later you expand the audience, well, that same number of participants is now a smaller percentage, and that might be misunderstood or more, require more nuance or context if you're doing a presentation to leadership. So, or even just trying to understand it yourself. So I think consistency is the key, regardless of whether you include or exclude postdocs or certificate holders or online graduates or whatever. In terms of defining engagement, I think that, you should always have sort of those strategic goals as your desired outcome of your activities. And then you work backwards from those outcomes to say, what metrics, what indicators that we could record would indicate progress towards achieving our stated goals. And so, just as a simple example, so many more people are doing virtual programming now because during COVID, all the programming was virtual or online. If that's one of your targeted goals to increase that, then that's one of the things you have to measure, right? Which is the number or type or result of people engaging in online activities. But I'm working with a consulting client that's about to kick off a very large traditional capital fundraising campaign, and they're planning on having events in cities all over the world. So those are traditional face-to-face activities where metrics associated with, well, this person attended our kickoff event. How do we track their engagement after that? And does it differ from somebody in the same city or the same graduating year or the same diploma program who didn't attend that event? So I think if you're internally consistent with the definitions, that's actually the most important thing. And because of the diversity of institutions and contexts, there's no definition that fits everybody, which is fine.
Yeah, I'm just that's very clear, Andy, and I think that internal consistency is really important. And I think that the challenge is, how do we deal with that evolving definition, right? Because we have all experienced that at some point we include and at other points we don't include, and for what. So that's something to really keep in mind. How do you deal with that? Joe, any of those challenges have you been able? You mentioned that you have an incoming president, and now you're also dealing with, okay, how do you really define this engagement, right? Are these some of the challenges that you are also encountering in terms of defining alumni and defining the engagement? And is that an evolving definition, and therefore the internal consistency is a challenge?
I don't know if I would consider it a challenge. I think we're, not to kind of jump ahead of our conversation really, but I think we're very fortunate in our programming and our resourcing to be able to know that, the engagement levels that we have and the definition we currently use, and certainly I don't think that would necessarily drastically change our metrics if we do kind of define it slightly differently. I think those numbers wouldn't hugely impact it, but I also think that we're very fortunate, not to say that we're highly resourced, but we have enough resource to be able to engage in that programming level. So I wouldn't say that it would necessarily be a challenge, and with our incoming president, I don't necessarily see that being a challenge with regards to the metrics and how we consider that definition of alumni at that point, to be honest. Okay,
nice to hear. Good. Well, you always sort of bring us forward to our conversation, Joe, and so which is good. So we've started to talk about these the metrics, and CASE has a comprehensive list of metrics, as Jenny mentioned, and how do you go about choosing the most relevant metrics for your institution? Joe, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in there, considering I just talked about the programming side of things. So, with Imperial for the last 6 years, we've really been provided with more opportunity to build our team, to build our division within advancement. So I think, from that perspective, we're incredibly fortunate to have had more staffing opportunity to build that programming. So we've got our events, we've got our, services and benefits, We have a great alumni center. We have our online platform. We have, you know, our volunteering engagement piece. So there's lots going on that allows us to be able to really draw on those engagement points. So I think from that perspective, we're incredibly, as I say, we're incredibly lucky, but we also have a very large community to service. And I'm aware that whilst we look within these statistics very high, you know, there's certainly a lot of challenges that we face as well. So, you know, I do think that it becomes quite an interesting conversation around, okay, so we have this resource, we have these programming points, we would define, you know, those areas. Jenny mentioned them before, you know, whether or not that's going to be your touch points of communication or contact updates or things like that, you know, having your strategies in place. But I think it's that other institutions perhaps that don't necessarily have that kind of level of support or resource to be able to do that. You know, we also have a data and insight team who receive the emails to say, right, it's time to go. You've got all these different reports to complete now, and they will support that work that we're doing. And I think from that perspective, it can kind of, you know, seem a really great way of showing kind of a benchmark and a report, but is it equitable across what's really happening, you know, for those people who aren't necessarily as well resourced?
Right. So this, I want to jump to Andy, because maybe you can give us some advice for, you know, institutions that are starting, institutions that, you know, do not have a big team, that do not have a lot of resources, you know, to be able to collect all these metrics. You know, which ones should they focus on? You know, where do you start?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And you know, Joe talked about staffing the analytical side of data. I think the one thing to keep in mind is sort of the opportunity cost associated with engagement metrics, you know, which is you need someone to collect the data, you need to track it, you need, you know, data input. Sometimes that's a manual process. Every minute that somebody on your team spends internally working with the data is a minute that you don't have somebody actually interacting with alumni, which is the reason that your team exists, right? So what you need is a balance. You know, it's easy to actually overinvest, I think, because you're concerned that you need a lot of metrics, and you don't need a lot. I think, you know, what you need is not many metrics. What you need is indicators that are relevant to the goal that you set for your program. And as long as you're able to track a few things that show progress towards your stated goals, again, it all comes back to strategy, right? Well, you know, what's your plan? What's your 1, 3, 5-year outcome intended? Then you can actually move the resources around to deliver the greatest impact. And that may include shifting resources away from engagement metric tracking and into events or volunteer management or communications, something that actually is visible and engages alumni themselves.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jenny, you know, CASE has a huge list, right? A comprehensive list. Is it possible to collect too many metrics?
You know, I think one of the more common questions I've gotten since CASE has released the alumni engagement metrics is, should we have someone manually going through social media to figure out who's capturing what? No, I repeat, no, that is not our recommendation. And in fact, I'm remembering my first interaction with Andy, and it was much around these same lines, where we were having a robust discussion about this, and we actually realized, oh, we kind of fall in the same agreement on what people should and shouldn't be doing. But I'm so glad you asked this question, because I think this, in some ways, if we think of fight or flight, I think there's some flight from, you know, being able to think about, oh, we can't ever do this, or to Joe's point, invest in this. And I think it does really go back to what Andy said about strategy, and to that outcome. One thing I'm curious about with this group of the people that are here today is, we've kind of been talking really broadly about percentage engaged and thinking about what's your population here. We've talked some about some specific outcomes, but I'd be curious of this group of smart attendees, what are the things beyond engagement that you think you need to know at your own institutions, and what are you tracking? So if that's something that you all would add to the chat, we'd really love that. And I did see a question in the chat that came in saying, we have someone that has a CRM to track engagement, but are trying to think about how you're using data to look at new donor prospects. And I love that question because, I do believe as we've looked at, as institutions are starting to use engagement metrics, we're hearing more and more things like, well, now when we see someone that's never given before, and perhaps all we had was some wealth screening or some additional information we could find, now we have a whole nother view of them that, oh, they actually always attend our events, or this person, volunteered in something that had nothing to do with advancement, but now we realize they do have a much tighter affinity. And Joe, that's probably something you've got some real insight on from the Imperial perspective.
Absolutely. I think that's really vital. And again, that comes down to the whole, where is it quantitative and where is it qualitative, and how do we really draw those stories out? And we have examples of, say, our Alumni Awards, which we do every year now. We're in our 3rd year, and some of the people that have kind of risen to the top that we were unaware of are now engaging with various aspects of the college. So we've had a huge amount of funding that's been put into a student group about building a rocket, and things like that, that actually that engagement would just never have been an option, would never have happened necessarily. And then, for example, we ran a panel recently, an East Africa event about entrepreneurship, and from that, the business school are now planning potentially to go out to Africa to work with different people. So it's these sparks, it's these conversations of engagement points that we use, which then really allow us to capture a story, to then retell that story to leadership, to again help them really understand what that looks like, what engagement really is in a much more tangible way than perhaps the metrics can show. And I think, Jenny, you touched on it as well. There's the conversion piece, and what does your internal metrics look like versus the engagement metrics from CASE, and how do we kind of utilize them to sort of hold hands in a much more beneficial way for us to tell those stories more widely to both our own leadership and also within the industry as well.
Yeah, no, that's exactly in the direction we wanted to move with the next question is, exactly. I mean, we've been with metrics, a lot of quantitative data. We collect a lot of quantitative data, right? Number of events, number of volunteers, number of volunteer hours. I mean, you name it. You can put a lot of stuff in numbers, with numbers. And, you mentioned ways that we can also start perhaps correlating data or finding meaningful ways that we can give those numbers a story, right? So you shared some of those experiences that you're having, Joe, or that at your school you're doing. Andy, any other ideas or experiences that you've had with other institutions, or your own experience that you want to share?
Yeah, I've had experience with institutions I work with as a consultant, at places where I've worked as the alumni executive, but also in many conversations with Jenny, as she indicated, where we've sometimes debated each other vigorously and disagreed, and sometimes found moments of complete convergence in our opinions. I would say, I mean, one of the things that comes up a lot is this idea that as soon as you start talking about metrics, people just naturally jump to this idea that there's some precise quantitative result that you're going to achieve, right? And that if you're measuring something, you must know it to at least a couple of decimal points.
And it should be one metric, right? Just one. Let's also put everything on.
What's your score, right?
Yeah.
This idea, and I think the example, I think in one of our early conversations, I shared with Jenny, this idea that if someone says something, we're talking about relationships, right? Kind of like, what's the temperature of your community? How do they feel about their identity as a member of this institution? And that's like pretty subjective and can be vague, which is fine. But the idea that you would then assign an exact number to that is really not sensical to me. I think the example I had given to Jenny was, it's like if you say to me like, haven't seen you for a while, how are you and your wife doing? I might say, things are great. We just renewed our vows. Or I might say, well, we're going through a rough spell right now, but we're trying to work things out. I would never say, oh, my marriage is like a 93.7. You know what I mean? And that idea that, our marriage is up 5% since last fiscal year. It doesn't work that way with relationships. And it doesn't mean you can't have a quantitative number, but it means that you're at risk of over investing in something that can't be known exactly, and underinvesting. And I think this is my main point, underinvesting in the expertise that you can use to apply an assessment or a judgment or an evaluation that's not necessarily quantitative. It can be more subjective and still really be valuable. What's important is not that it's precise. What's important is that your methodology is rigorous. And so that, you've thought it through carefully, you've incorporated all of the factors that are relevant. The last thing I'll say is the idea of correlation, because you used that word, Sandra. And this is like at the heart of it for me, is knowing what are the probabilities if somebody does one thing that they're going to do some other thing. So, if somebody doesn't attend any events, what's the likelihood that that person would become a first-time donor within the coming year? Compare that to somebody who attended an event and find out that the person who attended the event is, say 4 times more likely to become a donor. What if they attended 2 events? Well, now they're 8 times more likely. And that allows you to actually shift resources, budget, or staff time from programs and activities that may not be, and I saw this in one of the questions, may not really be bringing new people into the pipeline, and to try to attract some new people instead of just investing in the same people who have always been involved, which is sort of closes you off from growth. So I think those correlations are critical, and that's like a key thing. If you do nothing else with data, correlate behaviors and analyze that.
Thanks, Andy. So back to Jenny. Is Case doing correlations?
So yes, in fact, we are. And, I think we're just scratching the surface on this, because I think we're all just in some ways, again, at a very early stage of thinking about what are the things we need to know around engagement metrics. And going back to Joe's point at the beginning, that this is evolving. And I think it is the question of what are the things behind the scenes that are evolving, but also what do we care about? And so, what we've looked at right now is probably the first question we've got, which were things like, what percentage of our volunteers are also giving? What percentage of our alumni that engage experientially are also giving? What does that look like from a communication standpoint? And given that in general, it looks very low, what perhaps are ways that we think about, well, maybe communication is that first touch point, and maybe there's an in-between step, and it's silly for us to think that they're going to go from liking something to all of a sudden realizing we're a financial priority for this person. So I think that's been step one. And I think institutions, as they're starting to look at this, are doing exactly what Andy said, which is thinking about the strategy. This is the time of year where I'm doing lots of calls with people and thinking about how are you using results. And it's been quite fun to talk to some institutions that have been using these metrics for a couple of years and saying, well, our first goal was getting as many volunteers in, because we knew there were lots of volunteers that we had no idea who they were. And now that we have that, now we're trying to understand what is that benchmark of who's giving. And look, we paid attention, we really focused on that group, and now we have a higher percentage that we have been able to convert. And it may not be giving, it may be different for your institution of what that ultimate path is, but I think that's really where we're starting to see those correlations. And to me, I think that's really exciting, because I think that's where we get to start to see some outcomes that really start to move the needle.
So I'm wondering, is just as the last question, and we need to answer it sort of quickly, just to have enough time for the Q&A, is that, Jenny, you see the trend in the future in terms of this aspect of metrics? And
I think this is really exciting. You know, I was just at a conference last week, and I had attended that same conference 2 years previously. And I remember 2 years ago thinking, it was an alumni relations group, and I was thinking, they're not that happy to see me. Um, they're not so thrilled that the metrics person just walked in the door. And 2 years later, I actually had people that were showing me examples and saying, look, we used this and we made the case that we needed more people to do that frontline work, to Andy's point. So I actually think the future is really bright. And I think I think, to me, when I think about the future of where this is going, it's really all about strategy as institutions. I hope it's not, let's go crazy about getting the highest engagement rate possible, because I don't think that helps anyone. I have some worry that there will be some of that happens, but my optimistic side is that we can really do this to do more good, and that institutions are coming around and really embracing this.
Agree. Thank you, Jenny. And Joe, any last ideas in terms of where the trends are going with metrics?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things it really does encourage you to do is reflect it back into your individual meaning. And I mentioned that before. I think when you can take it as an example of where things are going and think, okay, well, how do we use that to create our own metrics? That's a really useful element here. And one of the things I wanted to jump in and say when Jenny was explaining the piece about volunteering and getting that information into whichever CRM anyone's using, again, it kind of gives a deadline to the institution to kind of really pull together what it is that's being collected and place it somewhere. And I also think that's a really important part of this. It gives that real generic guidance to institutions to say, well, this is something really important to collect. You've got a deadline of when that needs to go into the database. I think that's quite an important part as well. But I definitely think the correlations bit is important, and really being able to help institutions explain what that kind of move point is, you know, what the conversion is, should we say.
Mm-hmm.
I would add something really quickly, because I think you know, Joe just hit on something, which is, you know, there's, and this is in the Q&A, you know, somebody said some of the activities between alumni themselves. I would add that, and that doesn't necessarily get reported or assessed. There's also activity at large institutions taking place in academic units, in departments or colleges or centers or institutes directly with alumni that the central advancement team doesn't even know about. So what we know is that we're underreporting engagement, but we don't know by how much. And I'd be very interested over time if we can start to get better at assessing, estimating the extent to which we're underreporting engagement, so that we can project sort of, you know, the true scale of activity. The other thing I would say is the skill set needed to do all of the things we're talking about with data is kind of new. We're sort of where we were with like social media in 2005, where you all of a sudden you needed like a Facebook expert on your alumni team, you know, somebody who knew how to use TweetDeck or something. That this is now, you now need people who can do some basic correlations and sort of understand statistics a little bit. And so I expect that will become a much more sort of basic piece of professional competency that we look for as hiring managers when we're bringing new people into our teams.
Well, thank you all for your insights and good advice. I'm going to jump to the Q&A. The first question that I see here, because is for Joe. So Bruno Haza says that he also has Hivebrite as a platform, and they have created groups based on geography and are starting to implementing them for their fundraising. And he asked, do you have any best practices how you're making the best use of your platform, especially in terms of volunteering engagement? Do you also use the data from the platform for benchmarking? Because that's what they're lacking.
Yes. So yes, we do use the data for benchmarking. We have a 6-weekly kind of team catch up on where we're going with the online platform, any kind of developments, things like that. And one of our comms people in the team will put together an engagement report just to kind of very quickly update us on what our most popular pages are, who's engaging, how many new people we have, those kind of bits and pieces. With regards to volunteering, we've shifted, and Bruno, to be honest, it's probably best that you kind of get in touch with me after this and we can have a bit of a longer conversation, because really it's something that we have changed our strategy around where we started with Hivebrite and kind of, well, not Hivebrite per se, but certainly our platform and where we are now with it. So I think it's probably best that we have that conversation separately, because it's kind of a long story and I don't want to take over the the webinar talking about the actual developments and strategies around our platform itself.
Great, thank you. Thank you. There's another question from Hyder Ali, and it's about that the most valuable engagement is actually within the community, right? That alumni or the community members engage with each other. But most of the times, the metrics go on tracking the engagement with the institution. So any suggestions or recommendations on how to build methods to increase engagement inside the community itself? The examples, message boards, groups, offline, meetups, any suggestions there?
I just real quick, I mean, my immediate reaction is just sort of like this is not exactly in line with sort of tracking conversation, you know, the metrics conversation. It's more about programming. But then if you are programming, and the point is like there's a lot of programming that engages people with each other, and that's actually the definition of community, right? So that's a really good point. I think, you know, one of the things is to give your community members, your stakeholders, your audience, the opportunity to create and launch programs that they're willing to support. And that's about volunteerism. But then the other thing you can do in order to find out how much of that is going on and how do you incorporate that into your tracking of engagement metrics is to give them tools that they can use that integrate with what you're doing internally. So if somebody's using a completely separate system to send event invitations and track replies to events that are run by volunteers, it's very hard to get that into your system. So more well-developed programs have the resources to give volunteers access to a central system where they can use your system to send the invite, and the RSVPs come to you back at the institution so that you can get that into your database. It's a little bit, it's more of an art than a science, but it also, I wouldn't go crazy trying to track that. I would spend more time on the engagement part and come up with ideas for programs that actually people find interesting. So, you know, I prioritize the program relevance over the data collection, but that's just me.
Great, thank you. So one short question is, do you have any key learnings around using metrics for engagement to identify notable alumni? Anybody?
I want to say no. And I think it also depends on, you know, is that a question about using our own metrics that we're tracking internally versus the AEM reporting process that we would use? One would assume so, but I think more that comes down to research than using the metrics as our way of really identifying them. But I have to say the Alumni Awards program that we run, that's definitely a fantastic way of really, as I mentioned before, bringing to the surface those alumni that perhaps we aren't aware of, and the stories that come out are just mind-blowing. They're incredible alumni all over the world doing unbelievable, world-changing things. And I think that's been a hugely successful program for us to really understand what direction our alumni go into and some of those incredible people.
And Joe, you made me, that reminded me, one of the pieces that does fit into the case model and under volunteerism is a classroom speaker. And I do think that that is an area that people have said has been really appreciative, because again, having sort of this metrics behind it has been an opportunity to think about what are the systems in place so that we can find out who is coming to our campuses to speak or joining virtually. And so I do think having that, in some cases, I know the development shop has said that registration or that speaker information is just going to come through us. Thank you. And so then it is a way to know that that really important engagement happened.
This question made me think of something we didn't touch on, but I think it's worth mentioning. And I have a, surprise, I have an opinion about it. And that has to do with tracking individual engagement scores for alumni and donors versus using metrics to track trends of groups overall. I'm not a fan of assigning engagement scores to individuals for many of the reasons we talked about at the very top of the conversation about definitions, and also about the completeness or incompleteness of the data you actually collect. So I do think, however, that if you're tracking trends among groups or cohorts of alumni and donors, that's actually an appropriate use for metrics. That's could be the topic of a whole other webinar, but I just wanted to throw that out there since it hadn't come up. I do think on the last thing, I mean, Imperial has an amazing awards program for alumni. It really is great. And that idea of notable alumni really comes down to your definition of who's notable, what qualifies, and the importance of realizing that different parts of your community have a different definition among themselves. So a new grad might be more impressed by somebody who has, maybe graduated 2 years ago and has started 3 companies, all of which failed, than they would be impressed by somebody who's a CEO or an executive with a long history of corporate leadership. It's just different definitions for different stakeholders.
Right. Good. Thank you. For the next one, have you done any metrics or benchmarking on paid value benefits and ROI with new donor engagements?
I'll just say really quickly, I recently did a project on this topic, actually for European Business School. And it is a complex question. And I also think it goes back to what I said earlier about the differences between institutions, so that when a dean is very interested in what % of alumni joined a membership association at a peer or competing institution, I don't put very much stock in the answer to that question. It's good to know, but then you also need to dive down and find out how long has that program been in place? How many resources do they put into membership benefits? How do they define return on investment? How do they define engagement? It's a complex question. So I do think there's research to be done, but I also think that you want to double down on understanding your own audience, what their needs are, and who their other sources are for the kinds of benefits you're in a position to provide. You want to provide benefits that are unique to your institution and relevant to your audience needs. And that could be a pretty short list. It doesn't have to be 100 different things. But I think the metrics can be misleading at times if you rely too much on comparing your program to a program that has a very different audience profile.
Right. Thanks, Andy. One more, how do you get a healthy intake of new alumni faces instead of saturating, spamming your current alumni volunteers? Any, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you have to have a varied program of activity, really. I think, one of the examples that I would use is one of our programs, Alumni Insights, is really focused on building panels around our academic strategy. So what kind of areas is our academics working on and within our institutes at the university, and how can we really utilize our alumni community to come forward and work with the students and recent graduates to talk about how they got into those industries, what's changing in those industries. So I think really the more you can program with variety, the more you can reach out directly to people, because we're then not just doing automatic call outs and saturating the same groups to say, come forward, we really want your volunteering experience and you know, we want to work with you. We're going out directly and being proactive and doing our research and knowing exactly what it is we want to ask those alumni and, you know, what the volunteering role will look like. So we'll always kind of put together a volunteering role for any activity that we're going to run within our program. So I would say variety is really important.
Thank you.
I would add just real quick, you know, something that I can't think of a place where I've seen this done very intentionally, but I do think there's an opportunity if you're tracking metrics to understand which of the indicators you're tracking represents the breadth of engagement and which of the metrics represent depth. And you want to balance between broadening engagement and deepening engagement. So the idea that, you know, you're getting new people involved who maybe have never done anything before, that's your broadening effort. The idea that people who have already raised their hand and said, I want to help or be involved, you want to keep them engaged and you want to increase their commitment and connection with the institution. So you kind of need to get broader and you need to get deeper. And some metrics indicate one of those things and other metrics may indicate the other. And so it's good, as you're saying, we're going to record this, we're going to track this number or this indicator or this behavior, to stop and say, what does that represent? Does that represent growth of new engagement opportunities, or does that represent increasing engagement with people who are already part of our community and who are involved? And you want to balance, again, you know, what's the right number? It depends, but you need people coming back, but you also need a pipeline of new people, and knowing which metrics represent which thing can help.
And just from the case perspective, this is actually something we've been piloting for we're getting ready to have a second year of pilot results in, where we started to ask the question around retained engaged. So who are the people that we're keeping year over year? We originally said, tell us your counts of newly engaged and reactivated engaged. And one thing we found is that we're just not really able to make that distinction. So in the second year of the pilot, what we at least said is, tell us who engaged in fiscal 21 that did not do so in 20. So at least it starts to get to that piece that Andy was saying, you know, or at least are we bringing people back on board and seeing that by mode. So I think that's something as we think about the future that is really exciting, and some data points that will support this. One other piece I'll just note, we've talked a bit about engagement and philanthropy. We haven't talked so much about engagement and marketing and communication. And I'm just thinking of a conversation I just had with Jessica Elmore, who's part of CASE's Opportunity and Inclusion Center. As part of this, as we think about expanding, is to make sure that everything that's happening from a marketing communications perspective is also telling that story of different faces and different representations and different backgrounds, because I think that fuels our funnel as we look towards that programming piece.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. We're coming to an end, and Hivebrite will be sharing a survey link. So it would be wonderful for our attendees if they would just quickly fill it out. It's just, you know, just a feedback in terms of today's webinar, and it's always nice for us to hear how we can always improve. Well, I want to thank you, Jenny, Andy, Joe, for your insights, sharing your experience, and motivating us to go beyond the numbers and see how we can correlate to have an engagement story for our institutions and organizations. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for participating, for the good questions, and also for sharing your ideas in the chat. Thank you, everyone, and stay healthy. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.